Hey guys, I'm glad to see a full house here. Hope everybody's having a good day and you've checked out the Karma Cup. We're about to start a panel, which is really great. We've already had lots of great discussion. We'll continue to do that, so save your questions. I'll make sure to leave some time in for questions for this panel. So as they take the stage, I'm just going to introduce our panel. We're going to be talking about going from gray to green, transitioning into the legal cannabis market. So if you were here this morning, we already had Member of Parliament Nathaniel Erskine-Smith here, and he talked a lot about some of the government's intentions moving forward. So now we'll complete the circle and have these kind of industry leaders up here to tell us how we can kind of go about the new, the future landscape now that we have these new kind of outlines. So first on the panel is Adam Greenbatt. Adam Greenbatt is a self-taught advocate for safe access to medical cannabis and sensible drug policy reform, and has been immersed in the cannabis movement and industry for more than a decade. Adam has owned and operated medical cannabis dispensaries in Montreal until 2014 when the MMPR was implemented. He's a co-founder of Santé Cannabis, Montreal's leading cannabis clinic and resource center. Adam is currently brand manager Quebec for Canopy Growth Corp, and one of the largest producers in Canada under the ACMPR Act. So welcome, Adam. Thanks, guys. Matt Mernagh, a friend to Vapor Central, clearly. He used to have a podcast here at Vapor Central, and Matt is also the author of the Marijuana Smoker's Guidebook, which is like the essential smoking guide. Before I knew Matt, the epic legacy of your book had preceded you, so everybody thanks you for that. Is the only Canadian ever granted a court exemption to grow his own cannabis. Mernagh co-founded advocacy group 420 Toronto, or the Toronto Hash Mob, as it's so affectionately known. He's currently employed by Peace Naturals in their marketing communication department as a product specialist. And our last panelist, John Fowler, is the CEO of Supreme Pharmaceuticals, Inc. John has spent over a decade in the medical cannabis sector as a cultivator, patients' right advocate, and latter as an attorney. In 2013, John founded 7 Acres with a vision to build a company based on a passion for producing great cannabis and to share that vision with the world. Today, 7 Acres is one of Canada's leading cannabis cultivators and is embarking on a simple mission to cultivate great cannabis on a commercial scale. Prior to Supreme, John graduated summa cum laude from the University of Ottawa's Common Law program, God, I hope I said that right, and practices law at a large Bay Street firm in Toronto. So welcome all our panelists, guys. And I guess we'll just start it off. I'll open it up. Maybe we'll talk about what do you guys think of the new announcement as of this week? Or actually, we'll start. Why don't you guys tell us a little bit about yourselves and your journey in the industry?
You came up first.
We'll go this way, yeah. Well, to summarize, I used to run dispensaries in Montreal for 8 years, Montreal Compassion Center, and then founded my own with my partner, the Medical Cannabis Access Society, and that was a cannabis bakery and dispensary. And when the MMPR was implemented, we shut the dispensary down and turned it into a medical clinic. We brought a lot of the doctors who'd been referring patients to our dispensary into a clinical environment and started working under the MMPR. And Santé Cannabis continues to exist, but I left Santé Cannabis last summer to take a job with Tweed, and I basically run their Quebec brand management.
And this is Matt Mernagh, and I started in 2002 writing about medical cannabis for Now, and it's been a great journey. I got arrested numerous times. I've never been convicted of a crime, which is great. The Mernagh ruling. And where I was able to find one of my first advocacy groups was in 2005, April 16th. We hadn't done a lot of media. We did Toronto Sun. And the Toronto Sun, we actually convinced the Cannabis Control Board of Ontario would be the better way of dealing with cannabis at the time, like taxing and regulating cannabis. And there's like a handful of people involved in cannabis in Toronto at that point, and trying to come up with a marketing idea that people could easily grasp. It was easy to see, like, hey, let's just rip off the LCBO logo and put a C there. And that's what we did. You can see the images started flowing around again on the internet. So it's been a great journey. I started with Peace Naturals 18 months ago in their marketing communications, and it's been good. I smoke our product, so I'm their product specialist at the end of the day.
Hi, everybody. My name is John. I'm the CEO of Supreme. We own the LP 7 acres out in Kincardine, Ontario. This has been always an interesting room to come to because I spent probably most of my undergraduate degree here, certainly more than I was actually at U of T doing that. What's interesting is I actually started out as a cultivator, worked with some dispensaries in the city, but actually towards the end of that became a lawyer primarily to help with constitutional challenges like what John's worked on. Here in the front, you're actually my cover letter to law school. What's interesting, if you want to talk about how the world has changed in not a long amount of time, when I applied to law school, I did quite well. I should have gotten in anywhere, but I wrote this big sappy thing about helping cannabis patients and why I thought that mattered and why law school should matter. And I got into one school in the country after applying to more than a dozen. Last year, I was lucky enough to be a guest lecturer for Western Law, where we actually live casted a lecture from inside of a 10,000 square foot flowering room. And law schools now have programs, business schools have programs, so it's really changing. And what's interesting, my connection with Matt is when I was in school, I worked on his Court of Appeal challenge, and actually the people I founded 7 Acres with were put together by Paul Lewin, who was Matt's lawyer at the time. So really interesting for me. Everything is a progression, everything moves forward, so I don't see it as a clear gap. And I think that for companies like ours, we have a long legacy of great cultivators here in Canada to work with and improve on and just try to build the next level of scale for quality cannabis here. And for us, we're not a retailer, so our goal is to work with as many legal retailers as possible and hopefully see a more inclusive program here in Ontario as it evolves.
All right. Thank you very much for that. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Harrison Jordan. I'm going to be taking over moderating the panel from here on out. I want to thank you for those answers. My next question is, can you name one thing or one lesson you learned from the gray market or personal cultivation or dispensary scene, and one lesson that you can learn from the legalized commercial regime? Because I know all the three of you come from different background. I know, I guess Sante cannabis isn't really a gray market or personal cultivation, personal production scene, you would say. But I don't know if there's something you can name from that.
I was a designated grower.
Oh, you were? Okay. I was not aware. Sorry. All right. So I posed that question to the three of you.
So I think for me, the biggest thing I learned from 10 years through our program here is good cannabis matters. And I think that gets forgotten by some in my side of the industry. And that's always what we've focused on producing and understanding it's more than just cannabinoid content or cost to grow. It's actually got to be a good value for the consumer and something they're excited about. And sort of what I've learned in the legal side of it is that, like anything, regulations are just something you have to figure out how to execute your goal and your vision for a company, regardless how they are. So, we'll take branding as an example. I think, recently, longer in Vancouver, or recently here in Toronto, we've seen brands around gray market cannabis, but, most cannabis in the world is sold unlabeled, unbranded, and without a potency test. And we believe it's sold on just a question of who's got good stuff. I know every single person sitting in this room has asked that question at least once in their life and hopefully gotten the right answer. And as a company, we just try to work towards being an answer to that question.
Well, I think one of the things I learned from advocacy was like to speak for myself. And after 10 years of dealing with 52 division, for 420, you're just like talking to your CEO or other board members. You're just like, I don't know, dealing with police. It's a lot easier to deal with a board member, right? Because you're already at the negotiation level of, I think this is how I'll approach it. And so there is a lot of this skill set that I use, like the marketing skill set, how to converse about cannabis, and how to explain and market cannabis. It's just a crossover, really, to me. And when you asked about personal production, I mean, you have to put it in perspective. I know a lot of growers. I've seen a lot of grows. I've seen at what I thought were some pretty big grows in the MMAR, and it's not until you go to an LP grow and you see something like 7 Acres or Peace Naturals, and it's hard to comprehend as a personal grower, like, oh, that's like the size of Walmart, you know, and it's no comparison between like what I'm growing as on my own license from Health Canada and a company. It's just the scale is just a lot bigger, but if you do pay attention to the plant, and that's the biggest thing, and it's what we do at our company, is we make sure we're paying attention to the plant. It's the same type of growing, right? Whether you're a personal grower, you're paying attention to your plant. Whether you're a commercial grower, you're paying attention to the plant, as John says, to put out good product.
I remember when a 3.5 was a lot of weed. I think the biggest lesson that I learned in the gray market was that audacity is very powerful, and it can get you very far. It can get you further in the gray market than it can in the legal market. And so yeah, I would say that like audacity is important. It can get you very far, but compliance is more important these days, and it can get you farther, and you can there are ways to work within the system to affect the change that, you know, we all want to see, and to create the market that an ideal market for cannabis consumers, right? So yeah, that's my 2 cents on that.
So thank you very much for that. Health Canada is barring any products that also contain alcohol, nicotine, or caffeine with the cannabis that are sold. In addition, they are only allowing sales of dried marijuana, cannabis oil, and starting materials to start. Are there any products currently on the gray market, maybe moon rocks or coffee that has cannabis or shatter, that you don't think would be responsible to sell in a legalized regime? And would you impose a THC limit on legal marijuana products? How important is product diversity? Obviously, it's hugely important. So everything that's available on the gray market should be available legally at some point. It's not looking like it's going to happen overnight. This is clearly going to be a phased implementation of legalization. That's probably true for product diversity. I mean, product diversity is hugely important. My clinic was an intervener in RV Smith, and you know, it's important to patients. Like I think the most interesting product that's currently on the gray market that I would really like to see implemented are vape pens. Like vape pens are huge. I think over the next 5-10 years, there's going to be more people introduced to cannabis through vaporizer pens than any other means. And I think it's going to completely overtake inhalation. And it's great from a public health perspective too. I mean, like those things can really reduce the amount that people smoke, and it can denormalize smoking, which is what, you know, public health really wants. And really, it's good. That's where cannabis is evolving to. And obviously edibles and everything like that, but vape pens are important.
I 100% agree with what you said on terms of like product diversity. Obviously, more product diversity, the better. I mean, I don't get an input on Health Canada on those things, so people should be aware of that. It's just like, yeah, that's not me. Like, I'm not the guy at Health, just calling Health Canada and be like, yeah, THC limit's not a good thing, right? Just so people are aware. And then to me, I think creams would be like really great. My mom uses cannabis cream. My grandma uses cannabis cream. My sister, like people who don't traditionally use cannabis can really find those creams to be something to easily kind of cross the bridge over with cannabis.
Yeah, I think, as Adam said, like a phased approach to legalization is something I think I talked about here last year and have been talking for a long time. I think we have to remember, unlike the US, we're not doing it with a ballot initiative or a clear people-driven mandate. So one voice that you don't see in the Canadian dialogue, and you know, I think more people need to take up, is there's no voice of the consumer. So there's the, you know, the voice of the regulator, there's a corporate voice, there's a, you know, corporate gray market voice, but there's not a lot of voice of the consumer being a non-entrepreneur who just says, hey, I want creams or I want vape pens or things like that. And I think that's something that's really missing in Canada, and something that I hope more people will take up about and say, look, I use cannabis, I use many dosing forms, whether it's medical or recreational, and I want access to those. But I think the flip side is to me, if you say what the cannabis industry is, it includes the gray market, so you can get access for most Canadians to all of those things. As we transition over time, I think we have to remember, we don't want to go as far as everyone in this room would like, because we're essentially the 1% of cannabis users. Our biggest risk, being a democratic system rather than a voter mandate for this, is the next round of government saying, you know what, that was a fun experiment, let's try to put the genie back in the bottle. Now, I'm not saying it can be done, but I think that is a risk that we see in a slower rollout. Things like the Ontario government with their supposed provincial-wide crackdown is something I don't think anybody wants to see, or at least no one here wants to see. But I think the concept of a slow rollout that allows time to figure out regulations, like, edibles are interesting because people forget the complexity of introducing basically the narcotics law as we have it around all the laws around food processing, food handling, packaging, shelf stability. It's not quite that easy, and I think a slow rollout might be frustrating, but will give us a better end result.
The Cannabis Act allows the government to deny licenses under the Cannabis Act if they have reasonable suspicion that a person has committed an act contrary to the CDSA in the past. What are your thoughts on this discretion the government will now have, and would you have included that discretion in your own version of the Cannabis Act?
I think it's wrong. I think it's absolutely wrong. I mean, it's interesting that you got your license. Like that's like what you just said. I mean, like, technically, John here should not have his license, really. Sorry, buddy. But yeah, it's wrong. It's absolutely 100% wrong. Just to be clear, I mean, I don't have a PIC, which is the person in charge status. So when I go visit our grow, I have to have essentially someone with a PIC of that person in charge, and they babysit me, like, in a nice way. Obviously, I take the horticulturalist around like he's got the PIC. But, I find that it's sad. Like, it's you're trying to, like, cross us over and get us to transition to a legal market, yet your act clearly states that you don't want us. So you bring up a valid point. John?
I think it's also going to depend how it's used. So the current ACMPR for commercial growers has essentially the same language. And, I know lots of MMAR growers who, to the letter of their license, were diverting, and dispensary folks that have been able to get their PIC status. But also, I think, again, this goes to regulations being creative. I wasn't a PIC of my company for the first 2 years of the company. I ended up getting mine. I guess that's good. But, you can look at other ways of getting it done and achieving. I think that's one thing that a lot of people don't look through is, we don't look at who owns these cannabis companies. So I think, that's great. But I think overall, was it Denver recently that allowed license classes for people with cannabis convictions? I thought that was pretty neat. I hope we see something like that around at least economic amnesty for prior cannabis convictions. I think that's a good program and brings a lot of entrepreneurial diversity into the industry.
Yeah, I mean, it's on paper it's clearly discriminatory, but in practice there's obviously some discretion being exercised in how how people get their RPIC status, which just stands for responsible person in charge, which basically if you are touch cannabis or have anything to do with the plants or managing the growing, you have to have PIC status at an LP. But no, it's ultimately discriminatory. But like people who have licenses obviously need to be able to comply with the terms and demonstrate their ability to comply with the terms of the license.
And I think just going back, the workaround is the key. So we have about 100 employees. We have 20 of them that have PIC status, and I think we employ about a dozen cannabis convictions. So as an employer, we've decided we ask people in interviews, and if people are transparent about that they have that, so it doesn't come up later, like we don't check. And that's the way that we've gotten a lot of good talent in, and some of those people have actually successfully gotten their PIC status for legacy charges, so over a decade ago. But again, I think it's discriminatory, it should change, but don't see it as a bar to getting in the industry. If you really want to get in, figure out a way to do it and give it a go.
Great.
John has a question.
John has a question.
If you get a pardon, are you disqualified?
So I don't know exactly if anyone's ever challenged. You mean for the pick, the clearance?
Just in terms of the criminal record, there's some case law out there right now which has established that a lot of the Harper changes that made it hard to get pardons don't apply depending upon the date of your offense and the date of your record. So I'm just wondering, are you entitled to say no in answer to the question of have you been convicted of something within a designated drug offense in the last 10 years if you've received an official pardon?
I think the state of the law now is you would be able to. So it's certainly not like in an employment type question. It's not mandatory. More it comes out conversationally. It's not altogether hard to figure out who's grown or not. But for the pick status, because nobody's ever litigated against the denial, I don't think there's a clear jurisprudence on what exactly it means to be. I think in the ACMPR it's known or associated with diversion.
Known or associated with. So that's a big part there. The other thing is that you have to have an ability to show them where you've lived for a decade. You have to have an ability to show them that you've made it like where you've worked for a decade. So, I mean, I know a lot of growers that have a hard time meeting that status. Like, man, I can't remember where I lived for a year and a half. Like, it happens, right? Not to me, but it happens. And these are hurdles. Like, come on, like 10 years of your, like, where'd you live for the last 10 years?
So I guess really the answer...
I have the exact same roadblock filling out the RPIC form at Tweed, too. It's just like 10 years, man.
So probably the answer is if you can get a pardon, you should get one. It will help you in the application, but we still need to... and I'm very pleased to hear that there are people with records who have been accepted and are being brought into the industry, because I think that's a very important thing.
And on that note, there should be a fast-track pardoning process for cannabis offenses post-legalization. I'll just throw that in there.
Is that something the two of you agree with Adam on?
100%.
Yay or nay?
So how important will genetics be to the consumer after recreational legalization? Will the legalized regime be able to compete with the gray market in this regard? Or maybe they can borrow genetics from the grain market? How would that work? Is there a problem? And what are your thoughts on that?
So I think there certainly is a problem with lack of genetic diversity. I think it's a big risk for the legal industry the way it is now. There's lots of great people in the industry working to sort that out. I think that'll change over time. I've seen a few of those faces here nodding with a big grin. But I think the bigger issue is, it goes back for us is I think cannabis consumers tend to be pretty quality driven, and they're looking for a certain quality of their dried flower or other products. And I think there's more of a problem I see of good genetics grown poorly than poor genetics grown well on the legal side of the market. I think I guess the view of the importance of quality versus cost, I think needs to change before the genetics issue will even matter more.
I think genetics are obviously important. I got 150 strains in my book. I mean, we all want a variety, genetic diversity. That's also an issue. I mean, like Jordan of the Island out there in Vancouver Island there, currently you can buy 2-pack of seeds for get one free. I know Jordan. Give a shout out there. And it's weird. It's like you can't get Canada's best breeder. Like you can't literally buy seeds. And I'll tell you a story. Like the guys from Broken Coast grow cannabis, and they grow Jordan of the Island because there was a period in the program when you could acquire your genetics from MMAR growers, and maybe they should revisit that as a way to sort of bring in the fold transition these growers in, or like, oh, what type of genetics you got? Well, we want those genetics. Will you either come work for us? Can we buy you out? And make that transition that way. But they've since closed that loophole, so maybe they should look back into it to open it again.
Now, how about the two of you, first before you answer that, Adam, do you agree with that? Do you think that the personal and designated growers should be able to sell genetics?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah?
Multi-directional starting material transfer should be allowed, for sure. Yeah.
And that'll help the genetic diversity?
Oh, yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, Tweed works. We work with DNA Genetics. DNA Genetics comes in. We've got phenotyping projects on the go with them. We've been fortunate enough to be able to import genetics from Europe. So I mean, genetics are obviously key. Variety is the spice of life, and so is weed.
Now, my next question, because the three of you are in the system right now, in the licensed producer commercial system, what is one significant barrier Health Canada can remove right now for companies or individuals that want to become licensed producers? I have a feeling one of you at least will say the security clearance, but is there anything else other than that that's a hindrance?
I feel like you would know better.
We're going to
Yeah,
John Fowler on this one.
I actually think the barriers aren't as bad as some people think. So there's actually a number of licensed producers that were MMAR growers who transitioned for something in the range of $1 million. So certainly not cheap, but not exorbitantly expensive. Basically they bootstrapped. They really read and understood the rules. They did it on their own, not working with consultants, and figured out how to comply. So, the Broken Coast guys, are an example that sat literally beside an MMAR for a couple of years and was very successful. So I think, there are definitely changes that can make it easier to get into. But understand, for the time being, it's still a narcotic. It's still being sold as a medicine. Until that big N comes away, it's going to be hard to have kind of no barriers to get into it. But keep in mind, if you want to open a decent restaurant in Toronto, you're going to spend $500,000 to $1 million to do that. Craft brews spending a few $100,000, a lot of them doing any scale. So I think it's more about really understanding the rules and, again, working the regulations to the benefit. I mean, look at all the commerce that's come out of the MMAR regulations or their progeny, and people have figured out ways to make that work for them. And I think it's the same with the legal side. I think you can do it for a lot less money than some people think.
So as marijuana becomes legal from coast to coast, what sorts of geographical differentiation will we see with respect to outreach and marketing efforts across provincial lines? So will the cannabis consumer in Vancouver see one message and a cannabis consumer in Toronto see another?
Yes, they will, because you'll probably see a patchwork of state monopolies and private systems, and that comes with accompanying differences in what the market looks like. You may have all kinds of different, more heavily branded retail shops in a system where private retail is legal, and you may have more drab and bland and a plain experience in another kind of model.
No, oh yeah, 100%. I mean, and in terms of being in the marketing department, it could be it's already very difficult to work within the regulations to be in the marketing department. But then when you add, all the province regulations on top of that, it's going to get pretty tricky. But you're going to see. I mean, you're definitely going to see that.
I think that there will be the development over time of national brands. So if you look at tobacco and alcohol, there's national brands and there's regional brands. To Matt's point, where the challenge is going to be is deciphering all the different markets. So for example, in tobacco sales, their tobacco companies have $100 million advertising budgets in this country, so they're quite active. And if you look province to province, it's very different about who they can talk to, how they can talk to those persons, and where they can find to talk to those persons. So I think it'll be the same with cannabis. So I think you'll probably have more regionalization at the beginning, and it'll take some time for national brands to emerge that can effectively communicate and function with going to be 13 separate markets.
So as Canada is on the cusp of legalizing recreational cannabis, what does it mean to you to be a cannabis advocate? Or do you not see yourself as a cannabis advocate?
All right, I'll jump on this one. I like to be an activist for cannabis itself. I think in the legal side of the market, there's a lot of focus on the economics and not a lot of focus on it's just a good plant and it's a great product and people should enjoy it. You should enjoy coming to work to grow it. You should enjoy investing in it. You should enjoy selling it. And hopefully lots of people enjoy using it at the end of the day. And I think that's what we try to instill as a company. That's what we try to look for in the partners that we find to retail. That's part of why we positioned ourselves as a grower only as a company because we saw already lots of great cannabis retailers nationwide. So that's sort of where we look at it. And I think, it goes back to this idea, there's no voice of the consumer. Legally, it's very hard for a licensed producer to be a voice of the consumer. But I think that voice needs to be out there. Voices that just, say, look, you use cannabis, you love cannabis, and there's nothing wrong with that. And I think that's what's going to help drive product forms, better brand messaging, and things like that.
And it feels really fantastic. I mean, like, we've accomplished so much. Like, people told us that we couldn't get any of this done, and it got done. I mean, it's not done perfectly, but then I think that no government program ever is perfect. I mean, it's going to take time. It's going to take time to have our growers transition into a legit market. There are hurdles, but they're going to have to begin to accept that they're going to have to work within a system. And that's where I feel like, it is mission accomplished. We have accomplished a great deal. I mean, like, we're the only place, like, federal legislation. Like, it's pretty amazing if you really want to think about it. And if you really want to bring it right down, I mean, the Ontario government just committed to opening 150 retail outlets. Like, I don't know where else in the world that a government's like, yeah, we're just going to open 150 retail outlets. Don't look here. It's pretty cool, right? Like, if you think about, and she's a liberal. She's not a socialist. You would have expected an NDP government to do that, right? But no, Kathleen Wynne, it's pretty cool. Like, if you really want to think about it, like, yeah, it's bad. Like, a lot of our friends are losing jobs. I recognize that. But at the same time, I'm prepared to make a leap of faith and work within the system and get what I now recognize as things get done, because I think yelling outside the gates are no longer needed because, they've really welcomed us. We've really had an opportunity to speak our minds on this issue.
And you, Adam, what does it take to be a cannabis advocate these days? What do you need to do?
What do you need to do? I don't know. You need to be passionate and stick to it. I mean, I think, all the developments to date, even yesterday's announcement, like, it's all a good sign that we're winning and that we're on a great trajectory for, drug policy in Canada in general. I mean, I think it's going to be easier to legalize other drugs after this, which is also something that needs to happen. And I think the world is watching. There are legitimate critiques of a CCBO model, but as Matt said, imagine the droves of people taking selfies in front of the legal weed shops in Ontario. It's going to be fucking huge. It's going to be huge, and it's very exciting, and it's really awesome to be. It's a privilege to be at the forefront of it, especially at working with licensed producers. It really is an honor and a privilege, and I hope more people from the culture are able to transition and make it work for themselves under legalization, because that's the only way it's going to work for everyone.
I think something that's cool this morning. A Liberal MP came to Vapor Central to talk at this conference, and I think that can't be understated. He is a sitting MP who came to a Vapor Lounge and hung out for a couple hours and probably caught a wicked buzz on his way out the door. So. I think that there's a lot of critique, but if I look back to when I started as a cannabis advocate, legalization was binary. It was either it happened or it didn't happen. And the fact that we can even critique legalization shows how far we've come, where there's actually people that are like, I don't want this legalization. I'll hold out for what we have. But I think the key is for everybody in this room, if you don't know, every politician, federal, municipal, and provincial is talking with cannabis people right now. So now is your time to write letters, send emails, and calls. And even if you don't get direct, just so you understand, every politician's office tracks those things. And they say one call is worth however many constituents that may or may not think that. So if you want to see something different, if you don't want to see just CCBO stores, if you want to see more inclusive products or things like that, get active, send letters, do that. It might not feel like it's working, but I can tell you from meetings that we have with politicians, they track that data. They'll come to a meeting with charts to talk about constituency data at all three levels of government. So, I think there's a lot more activity that, the 100 people in this room, could be doing. If everyone sends, a half dozen letters a week, that's literally hundreds of letters every week going out to government. That will make a difference, and that needs to continue to happen even post-legalization to keep moving towards the version of legalization that you want to see.
So I just want to open up the floor to any questions, if we have any questions. Any questions?
Jack, you wanna
Bueller?
ask a question?
Bueller?
Jack wants to ask a question.
Sarah Hanlon has a question. Jack Lloyd has a question. Sarah Hanlon has a question. They both have a question now.
Given just these new announcements, what if you were going to recommend someone getting into the industry, and maybe in some kind of non-conventional ways too, some periphery industries maybe, is there anything that you would suggest to somebody? Or maybe sticking with a more reputable, well-known thing that's already kind of going? What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, if you're asking about looking for employment, I mean, like, job resumes help, cover letters, researching the company that you're applying to helps. I mean, like, it's,
I mean more if looking at it, what do you think production, sales, like of the industries, what do you think will be the easiest for people to access, let's say if they do have a criminal record or something like that?
oh, if they have a, well, I mean, if it,
Or not, just if they're,
okay.
if they have a lot of knowledge but don't know where to start in terms of the industry, because it is new.
Well, I mean, like, again, I think it goes back to researching the company. I mean, they have job postings online and just look at them and be like, oh, I'm suitable to work in manufacturing, or I'm suitable to work in marketing, and matching their skill sets to the job, I think helps. And recognize that a lot of LPs, I mean, I don't know how big Tweet's going to get, but I mean, we're doubling in size in terms of employees within
We're
a year.
octupling.
So
That's
in
good
what,
to know.
in what
Oh,
kind of,
octupling, eh?
so I guess
How
my
big are you getting
question
there,
is,
John?
what kind of fields are you hiring in within your companies?
Every single department. The HR is probably the busiest department. I would say though that I think the window of time where like only your gray market experience as a CV, I think that window of time where that is an opportunity is shrinking. And I think that as the industry legitimizes and becomes even more and more mainstream and becomes like the above board institution that it is, that increasingly, you know, diplomas and horticultural certificates and science backgrounds and STEM degrees and these kinds of things are going to matter even more, and that your street cred, the window where street cred is valued at a higher level, I think is shrinking.
And it's now, like, literally, like it is, right? Like, the window is, you're right, 100%, because the window is shrinking, and it is going to end up in colleges and universities where they're going to teach courses on this. Like, we see it coming. Like, but right now, you have a wealth of information that LPs want to work with.
I think for our company, we're at 100 employees. We've hired 50 employees in the last 90 days, and only about half of our staff touch the plant. So, we have, I think, 4 PhDs on right now that work in our kind of science-driven departments. We have accountants. We have, a whole range of people outside of just kind of growers and processors. Nobody's talking about this. The LCBO or CCBO basically announced, 500 to 2,000 jobs coming for that supply chain. And I think, if it's kind of getting a job looking at that, I think if you're an entrepreneur, like great entrepreneurs work through partners. And I think cannabis entrepreneurs need to find business partners. There's a lot of great growers I know who just aren't the best business people always. And being able to find people so you can take that expertise and take that thing that you do better than anybody else, whether it's growing a product or something, and working with a partner that can actually get that to market in a regulated industry. Like, we have to accept cannabis for the foreseeable future will be highly regulated. There's a huge value in compliance and being able to speak through the language of compliance. And I think, it's just about how you get in. I'll be quite honest, I own 2% of my company. I gave up 98% of it so that it could happen. If I wanted to own 51% of it, I wouldn't have a company right now. So you just kind of do what you have to, and if you want it bad enough, you'll make it work.
Great. And I have a question from the audience. We have a question out in the audience. Yes.
So there's an article where Apria said that to compete into the CCBO market, they'll have to make price around $5 a gram. What's your perspective on how craft growers or smaller growers are going to be able to get their products on the shelves of CCBO that is further the case?
So I think in the short term, the CCBO, like every other cannabis retailer, is going to need products. So I think Ontario actually has to price fairly with other provinces. Otherwise, they're just not going to get supply from LPs, I don't think. But I think also like it's really important if everyone goes online tonight and Googles LCBO's pricing model, it's actually all public how they mark things up. So the big focus on the big bad numbers with like close to quadrupling margins and tripling margins is imported spirits from large producers. So Bacardi, Smirnoff, and things like that. So non-Canadian basically liquor sellers. If you go to the other end of the range and you look at what the LCBO's markup is for Ontario produced wine, which is basically a craft wine, that's actually a very favorable markup. That's less than a double that they put on it, which is probably better than most dispensaries today are giving their growers. So I think it's important to see, even in the LCBO model, there is a range. And there is especially for Ontario producers, there's a partnership with government, right? Government has to think of when they're pricing not only the profitability of the CCBO, but they think about the jobs that are involved in the supply chain, which is a logic they use with domestic alcohol production right now.
And I think also on the craft dispensary side, or craft grower side, it's hard to, I have yet to have someone really define what a craft cannabis size is. Like, is it 15,000 kilos a year, which is not a very big license, and I think it's doable for a lot of growers. So I think we have to look at that, and I agree, like Ontario is going to put a priority on Ontario growing cannabis. I mean, you can look at New Brunswick. New Brunswick has put a priority on New Brunswick growing cannabis. So you might even want to look at, if you were to open an LP anywhere, like, hey, where can I get the best bang for my buck? I mean, New Brunswick will even give your government's giving money. The New Brunswick government is giving money to people to get their licensed production up and running. Like, at least Organigram got money, and a Native Reserve got money from them to start LPs, right? So there might be more opportunity there.
I think the quality of the weed's going to matter more than the price, to be honest.
All right, we have another question from the audience. How, the three of you come from 3 different LPs, and things are supposed to start selling July 2018. How ready are you supply-wise to hit the ground running? Do you have surplus right now that you can use come legalization? What's that situation like?
Contrary to the myths, there is not some stockpiled recreational reserve happening. Coincidentally, we announced $1 million square foot expansion of our greenhouse facilities in Niagara on Friday. So, I mean, everybody's amping up capacity, and everybody's got expansion plans, and we're still going to need more.
Yeah, I mean, like, nobody's stockpiling cannabis that I know of. I mean, we're selling and selling and selling already, and there's a
It's going to be hard to make the July.
Well, there's a 310,000 square foot facility being built. I mean, if you want legalization CCBO model to be perfect on day one, no, it's not going to happen. Are you going to change people's shopping habits overnight? No. But are you going to change people's shopping habits over a year, a couple years? Yes. Easy.
Remember when the medical marijuana program was perfect on day one? That's a question for John.
I think, look, the idea that legal cannabis is going to be fully supplied on day one, I don't think anybody credibly is taking that. So, licensed producers certainly are ramping up capacity. For ours, I think we'll be maybe 10,000 kilos a year by then. But, at the end of the day, for us, I think it's the quality and the pricing that'll come out of quality that's going to be most important. So I'd rather sell a smaller amount of great cannabis than a larger amount going the other way.
What about the medical patients? How do you guarantee the medical patients don't get left behind?
Yeah, that's a great question. How do you guarantee
As a medical patient, my company's still 100% committed to running the Peace Naturals brand as Peace Naturals Medical. 100% we will be remaining a Peace medical patient. And people want to know about that. I declared $17,000 in taxes for medical cannabis, and I assure you, I'm not about to give up that tax benefit anytime soon, because it's great. I mean, like, we can't lose this cannabis program because we're just getting insurance companies to pay. We're getting government to accept that it's a taxable benefit, and we can't lose it just for those two things. Like, it's going to come up with different coverage. I mean, like, we need to insist that these CCBO profits, if there is any, and when there is any, is that it goes to people on ODSP who need to use this for medical reasons. And we're not going to lose this program, I guarantee you that.
I mean, Canopy's committed to continuing to serve patients, and they'll be given priority. I think there's going to be, at some point, patients registered up to a certain date will be prioritized. Yeah, I mean, the ACMPR continues for many years into this. Like, we'll still have parallel programs for several years. It's not just, medical's not going to be over, and patients are the most important. But, I hope that medical access can evolve too. I mean, like, it's not fair to just send patients to the CCBO to buy cannabis. It doesn't make sense. They need specialized access. It's why, there are good medically focused dispensaries who are providing, important patient care. There's important specialized cannabis clinics where doctors work and do research into the medical utility of cannabis, which will ultimately lead to us getting a drug identification number for cannabis. And that's really the end game for medical cannabis. Like, these systems shouldn't be mutually exclusive. Like, there should be cannabis, there should be cannabis in many different medical establishments. I think I want to see medical cannabis access evolve. It should be in pharmacies. It should be in private dispensaries where healthcare, professionals supervise the business. Like, I don't see a reason why the specialized cannabis clinics now can't dispense cannabis. So patients need special care. But the end game there is a sort of pharmaceuticalization of cannabis via the drug identification number, and also getting it registered as getting it an NPN, getting it a natural products number as well. Like, CBD should be sold over the counter. Like, creams you don't need a prescription to buy a fucking CBD cream. Give me a break. It's like, it doesn't make any sense. So, like, getting cannabis through the regulatory hoops that we can just sell it over the counter as a natural health product is also a huge project.
We have a question from the gentleman in the Canada hat who's been patiently waiting.
So in regard to places like Vapor Central, basically, because I believe it's also part of taking care of recreational people and also medical people. So what is the LP or the industry is going to do right now with that? Because not only we're lacking of this, right?
You're talking about consumption places like here?
Yeah, side to socialize and be fine to use cannabis in the same way, right? But like also, if we think about Ontario right now, what they decided essentially, right? So we're supposed to theoretically only use cannabis in your house and not have a place like that. So unless you're a research facility licensed by Health Canada, right?
Yeah.
So what is the industry going to do about this? Like, very carefully, is they going to lock it?
Right. So.
Well, I can tell you that for our Quebec consultation, the Quebec public consultations, we strongly encouraged them to consider licensing establishments where people can use cannabis, particularly because the landlord associations are losing their shit about people smoking weed in fucking apartments. It's so annoying. But, there's going to be probably prohibitions on smoking cannabis in multi-tenant units. And the only way to make that work is by allowing places like this where people can come use cannabis. Whether that happens or not, and whether, the crazy anti-tobacco lobby is going to, fight heavily on that, we're up against a huge fight there. But I can tell you that that's something that I personally pushed for in the Quebec consultations on behalf of Canopy.
I can speak to this directly. At Vapor Central, I've lobbied the Ontario government to the point where the Ontario government referred to me as a consultant. I was quite shocked when that happened. On vapor lounges, the minister agreed with us, and then the next day flip-flopped on the issue. So the minister, I don't know if anybody remembers, she said, smoke it anywhere. And we were just like, oh, you should have really called me before saying that. Yeah. The media on them, at that point, it was on. Literally, I got called back to committee to do a 10-minute disposition, and I was warned in advance that it's on. They're bringing in, the Canadian, the cancer people were there, MAD were there, police chiefs on the day one of this thing. And you're just like, yeah, we're going to lose this fight. Vapor lounges are hugely important. I wouldn't have been here for over a decade. This one I've been with over a decade. We're not going to lose vapor lounges. The minister even came out and said in the Globe and Mail, I looked it up, he's like, well, we're going to study the issue. Well, the minister should come down, study the issue for an hour or two and then leave. Because I'm certain after a couple hours, he's going to know nothing bad happening here, and people need to socialize. And to me, last point is that vapor lounges played a more important role in many ways to the establishment of where we're at now than the current retail dispensaries that just recently opened within the last 2 years. Vapor Central has been the home of like 420 Toronto and the Smokeouts, the Global Marijuana March so a lot of the advocacy has happened like literally right in this building. And we're not going to let that go. I guarantee you that.
Yeah, I think it's important to keep places like this going. I think Toronto is one of the world leaders for these kind of social cannabis clubs, which I think is fantastic. I think it was interesting. A lot of people, didn't see kind of in the conclusions of the press conference that they're looking into it. And remember, if you're a recreational user today, even consuming in your private residence is currently illegal. So it is a step forward. But I think also look at a place like Colorado. In Denver, it took them a couple years to get it right, but eventually they figured out an opening. It all just goes back to whether you're a consumer or whether you're an entrepreneur that wants something like this to be open, make sure you continue that conversation with all three levels of government, because the average regulator might not understand why this is important, not just for the business of cannabis, but just for cannabis users and just for having a place to go to socialize the same way we have access to 20,000 bars in this province.
And we have a question from John Conroy.
I was going to say, people used to drink outside on the streets, and we created bars so that people would go and drink inside. Isn't that what happened? History, again, should be repeating itself in that way. But my question is basically, I think from the discussion we can all agree, and my information came as a result of course, the evidence in Allard with respect to how patients were having trouble waiting to get their strains and so on through the LPs because there weren't enough LPs and there wasn't enough supply and so on and so forth, not enough diversity developed and so on, which the sounds is coming along. People are still having a hell of a time getting their licenses renewed under the ACMPR. It's taking 4 to 6 months. And so by the time they're renewed, they're only good for 6 months because the doctor's letter is only good for a year. So we're still having problems in the medical end that's been around now for a little while, getting the supply. And we're going to have that compounded come next July in terms of meeting recreational. So I think we're all agreed that we need more people coming in and helping the producers and getting in with the producers and producing more, and that's a federal controlled area. And we need the provinces to hopefully come up with a wide range of models of distribution in terms of dispensaries and stores and so on, again, because most people don't want to grow for themselves. Most people simply want to go to a store and buy it. That was clearly the evidence that came out in Allard. So it sounds like those are the two big areas we have to work on, getting more in there in terms of the producers and really getting this dispensary storefront thing. People are going to grow medically, as you said, for the next 5 years. They said they would look at both models. There's some interesting differences that there's going to be some law enforcement issues, I suspect. But nevertheless, people are going to grow medicinally and people are going to grow recreationally. All of that's important to legalize the whole situation. And once we've done that, hopefully we'll be able to get rid of this 14-year maximums and all the rest of the criminal law that's still hanging around up in behind.
I think the legal challenges to come are going to be quite interesting to watch.
All right, does anyone else have a question? Oh, more questions.
I'm Daniel from Dope Chef Media. I was wondering, you guys feel free to not answer if you don't want to, but I was wondering about some of the controversy or some of the danger around working for an LP. Is there any, I guess socially, is there any thoughts you have on like the haters or any difficulties with that?
You got death threats, right?
Yeah, your activist friends will hate you. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, like it's. I don't know. I mean, I'm gonna attempt at least a little bit. I look at it like I grew up in the early '90s and listened to a lot of punk music and a lot of like grunge music, and like they threw that label at Nirvana. Like I'm like, you sold out, man, and like since even then I'm like, I don't even know what that means. So to be truthful, like it's easy to block out and it's easy to not get into a discourse with them because they're just gonna hate. But to stay open-minded enough and stay connected to this community enough and recognize that, you know, you have a great opportunity to talk to people like John and myself and Adam. Like, we're still here. We haven't gone anywhere. But when you hate on us, like, I'm not going to listen to your message, but I'll listen to you if you're going to stop and talk to me. Like, yeah, man.
I would just add that the haters only serve to remind me of how much I don't like or appreciate the zealotry and the dogma that really poisons activism.
I think for probably everyone here, it's an interesting call of your Facebook friend list when you say that you're out running an LP. So there's not a lot of historical memories for things that, like these guys have done for over a decade in this space. But I think the other one, this is just more a fun story. It won't apply to anyone in this room or watching online. We've got a bunch of employees who don't think about one thing when they come to work for us, which is their kind of family finding out they work in legal cannabis. So these are non-cannabis people. So one of my favorite is when we first started cultivating our controller, basically I had to go pick her, I think 4 or 5-year-old daughter up from school because she was running around the school saying mommy grows pot. And the school didn't quite know how to deal with that. And I think this fall we're now getting a high school co-op student. So again, things change as long as you're transparent. And I think, one thing I hear a lot of is kind of these blanket, boycott things. I think if you really want to do something and affect change, pick who you boycott against, because there's a big range in LPs in terms of how they operate, how they view kind of the gray market and dispensaries. And I think rewarding the better ones is actually going to do more for change than kind of painting everybody with the same brush.
All right. Anything else? Okay, I think we are good to go. Thank you very much for being here, panelists. Can I get a round of applause for them, everyone?